Welcome again to everybody who's here already. My name is Rebecca Ihata. I'm Careers Advisor for researchers here at the University of Oxford Career Service. I'm joined today by my colleague Damilola Odimayo, who's going to be looking after your questions. Damilola, do you want to switch on your camera so people can see you? So Damilola will be handling the Q&A. What we're going to do today is to walk you through the slides that we've prepared with lots of tips and ideas about thinking about postdoctoral research, and then we will have a Q&A session at the end. So if you have questions as we go through, please pop them into the Q&A bar. Damilola will be looking at them. If you see a question there that is very similar to the one you want to ask, if you can like what's there or put a note on that, that's very helpful for us. We can see what are the most popular questions, things that people most need to know, and we'll start with a focus on those. We'll be sharing a link for this recording, at least the slide part of it, after the session. It may take us a couple of days to get that up, but just know that you will be able to come back. So don't worry about making notes about everything that we cover on the slides today. OK, let's get going then. I'll just switch my camera off so you can focus on the slides. Hit the right button there. So what we're going to be looking at today is thinking about, well, what actually is a postdoc or postdoctoral research position? What are the typical pathways? Where does a postdoc take you? What are the expectations? What are the reasons why people are doing postdocs? How, if you're thinking about doing a postdoc, can you be strategic about making sure that it is successful in what you want to achieve from it? And then if you, after this speech, think, well, actually, maybe a postdoc isn't the thing that I should be doing, we'll just have a very brief touch on alternatives and then signpost you towards some resources to think a bit more thoroughly. So we'll start with the obvious question then. What is a postdoc? It's a term which you hear a lot in universities like Oxford, which is a research intensive university, but it can be quite a mysterious term. And it's also a term which can mean several different things, and that's important to know. It has different titles depending on which department or team is advertising for that kind of post when it's in academia. So you'll see job advertisements for postdoctoral researchers, postdoctoral scientist, postdoctoral officer, postdoctoral assistant, and these are used almost interchangeably, although there are some differences in terms of perhaps seniority, or perhaps there's some more just what the recruiter's preferences are. So generally speaking, it's a research role linked to a specific academic project, and we'll think a little bit more about that word academic afterwards. So important to know that it is project linked, and therefore it's project funded, and that means short-term funding. So it's not a permanent post in academia. We don't get postdocs who are appointed to just serve on multiple projects. They come for a specific piece of work. And that is generated by a research grant, which has been awarded to a senior academic. And in the language of the postdoc world, this is a PI, or principal investigator, who's put together a funding bid, and in that funding bid has said, look, to carry out this piece of research work that I propose, I will need 2 or 3 or 5 postdocs to help me carry out that work, to deliver on the project. In days gone by, a postdoc was seen as an apprenticeship. It was a kind of a necessary, in many disciplines, although not all, step to getting onto the lectureship or more permanent roles within academia. And that's important to think about, because many people are viewing postdocs as a case of, well, once I finish my PhD, I'll go and I'll be able to design my own research agenda. That's not what a postdoc is. A postdoc is working on somebody else's project, and it's, although you're employed, you're a member of staff, it's really another training opportunity in most cases. Perhaps as you become more senior, you will be given more independence to set the research agenda within a project, but it's not usually your project, it's the project of the senior academic or principal investigator. It is a good opportunity to develop some technical research skills and to really deepen your knowledge on the project topic or theme. It's a good way to be learning from academic colleagues who have been doing research for longer than you have, who've really developed some specialisms, often working on real cutting edge research. So that can be a way to get a bit of guidance to step on from your PhD. And in many cases, but not all, it is a necessary post for academic progression, and we'll talk about the differences between different subject areas and how postdocs sit within the different fields in a little bit. What's important to note here, though, is that there are postdoc opportunities in industry, predominantly in the pharma sector or in science R&D type organisations, and there are a lot of similarities here with an academic postdoc, but there are also some marked differences in the sense of probably you're going to earn a bit more, and you may have a slightly more structured and a system to work within and a bit more work-life balance, but we'll talk about that again a little bit later on. So that's basically what your postdoc is. It's a temporary post. It's post working on a specific project set up by a senior academic. Another more tongue-in-cheek way of thinking about this is that it is a job in which you will spend a lot of your time thinking about your next job. So as this cartoon nicely illustrates, these jobs are short-term and often very short term. I've known postdocs who are in post for 6 months, which means as soon as you're in post, you're starting to think about what your next post is. Not all of them, some are a bit longer, and 3 years is a kind of average. It will depend again on your subject area and the grant which has been brought in for the piece of research that the postdoc is attached to. But worth bearing in mind that a lot of a postdoc's time is taken up, or their attention and their concern is taken up with thinking about what their next job is going to be. So that humorous look aside, we want to think next about what are the reasons why people do postdocs, and just spend a minute on your own. If you've got a pen and paper, you can make a note or just think through for yourself. Why are you here today? Why are you curious about the world of postdoc? What is it that you think could be, that makes you think this could be a good opportunity for you in terms of moving your career forward? So I'm just going to give you a minute to think about that, and then I will show you some of the typical reasons we hear from people who go into postdocs or are considering postdocs. So just make a note of your own thoughts on this for a minute. Okay, hopefully you've come up with 1 or 2 ideas of your own there. This is a set of some of the common reasons that people mention when they're either in a postdoc or looking to apply for postdocs. And as you'll see there from that list, enhance publications or research record, build collaborations and networks, develop technical research experience. These are, really good reasons for thinking about a postdoc in terms of the fact that they are typically best developed in a postdoc environment or in an academic research environment. And that's true for several of the items on that particular list. What isn't true, however, is that all of those that are aims that you can only achieve by working in a postdoc position. So some of the things on that list, which may be side motivations, but in some more worrying cases are actually main motivations. So getting to work in a different place, or having a bit of time to figure out what you want to do next, or simply paying bills. Those are not particularly solid reasons to do a postdoc, in the sense that you can actually achieve those things through a number of different career pathways. So if those are your main motivations, if your main motivation for doing a postdoc is because you want to travel, I would say you might want to reconsider that. have a think at least about broadening out your range of options and speak to a careers advisor who can explore what those options might be for you. It's not the easiest of careers to get into, so to do it for a reason which is less than 100% tied to the academic setting is probably something that should make you think again. Really important to know and to be thinking about even before you get into your first postdoc, if you do decide to go down that route, is that this is not a long-term career. There's a fantastic book which I highly recommended if you're considering doing postdoc work by Liz Elvidge and her fellow authors, called What Every Postdoc Needs to Know. If you are considering that, now is the time to be reading it. And they have said very clearly, a postdoc is not a career. It has to be a stepping stone to a next role. As you saw in the earlier slides, this is what a postdoc is designed to do. It's designed to just give you a step, deepen your technical expertise and get you ready to move on within academia. And it is very easy to go from one postdoc to the next, or to go into a postdoc and then find that that's going to be extended for 6 months and then extended for 3 months and then extended for another 6 months. And before you know it, you have spent 8, 9, 10 years in postdoc roles, not even necessarily going into a more senior role, but just changing from postdoc to postdoc or finding your work expanded and extended. And that isn't great if your purpose for being here is to develop an academic career. Once you get past a certain number of years in a postdoc, people will wonder why you aren't going for a promotion or for a more senior or more permanent role. And that's not a good question to be triggering in people's minds when you come to the recruitment scene. You don't want people to think, oh, are they not capable? Have they applied for lots of things and not been successful? Those are the kind of typical thoughts people would have once you get to, you know, kind of 7, 8, 9 years in postdoc posts. Now, if you just want to stay in lab work, for example, if you're a scientist, then that's a different proposition, but you're probably anyway not going to be able to maintain that as a postdoc, because as you become more senior, you also become more expensive, and these are posts which are linked to grant funding. Many PIs, principal investigators, will be interested in hiring new blood, which is much cheaper to hire. So you can't stay forever in a postdoc, and that's why it's really important to be thinking, if you are considering this, okay, this is a temporary step. I need to make sure that I've got my exit strategy in place even before I get into post. I can't just wallow in this, convenient as it can be, and convenient as it is for PIs who know your work. It's not healthy for developing an academic career. So we mentioned that it can be a necessary step, a postdoc can be a necessary step for developing an academic career. This table, which comes from the Elvidge and Al book, splits things out into, well, okay, if you want to stay on to develop a permanent career, and the word tenure track there comes from their book. It's not particularly apt in the UK. What they really mean is a permanent career, and even most permanent posts in academia are not necessarily permanent if the funding runs out. But if you're aiming for that permanent career in academia, then for many subjects, a postdoc is an obvious stepping stone onto other things, but not all, and we'll go on to that in a second. If you're thinking, well, I'm going to do a postdoc and then I will probably go to industry, firstly think about an industry-related postdoc if that's your ultimate endgame, but also just be aware that actually most industry partners aren't necessarily going to want you to be trained in an academic perspective. Much better to actually get your training in industry. So whilst it can be attractive, particularly if it's a shorter term postdoc, it's not necessarily going to make you more marketable. Again, you need to check the details for specific careers to be sure what do people typically do. Is this something that everybody going into the firm that I'm really looking at is doing those postdocs before they get the roles that I really want to get in the end. For other jobs, postdoc again might be helpful, but isn't necessarily going to be what you need. And again, check the specific roles, have a look at the profiles of people who are in the posts that you aspire to and see whether those people have all got postdoc experience, or have they actually gone from PhD level straight into the kind of posts that you're thinking about applying for. LinkedIn is a great way to have a look at this kind of profile of people doing roles that you want to reach out to. In pretty much any other sector, really, a postdoc isn't necessarily going to help. That doesn't mean it's going to hinder you, but it's not necessarily going to take you forward. So you need to weigh up carefully whether that extra experience is worth the pain, the competition, and the potentially lost earnings in order to stay in academia. I'm not at all saying that postdocs are not good. They can be a fantastic way to get some experience, but go into it with your eyes open if you do decide to go down that pathway, and be really sure that it is going to give you some kind of an advantage, some kind of extra training, some kind of, added value, rather than just being a way of postponing going out into the workplace beyond academia. So the caveats here are that, particularly, though this isn't always the case for those people who are in the social sciences or humanities, postdocs are much less common. There are many fewer postdoc positions available in humanities and social science research, typically because projects are quite small scale. And therefore it will quite often just be a couple of senior academics who are delivering work, though it isn't always the case, and they do exist. They're just fewer in number. What typically happens then for social scientists and humanities is that you will, if academia is your aim, you may end up taking an early career fellowship. You may end up, if you're in a very fortunate position, being able to apply to be a co-investigator, so to be named on a research project with a principal investigator who may be somebody who could be your PhD supervisor, it could be somebody else that you've been working with in your department, or you may get a teaching fellowship or a lecturing role. Many social scientists, for example, will go straight from their PhD into a junior lectureship. So it's not that it's not right for social sciences and humanities, it's just those positions are, because there aren't as many of them, people end up taking that step in different ways. So just be aware of that. Okay, my other big warning here is that if your reason for wanting to do a postdoc is that you are planning on an academic career, again, go into this with your eyes open, please. Lots of PhD and DPhil graduates are keen on doing this, but there are far more PhD graduates and DPhil graduates than there are postdoc roles or fellowships available. There's a real filter going on there. And then again, if you're thinking about moving past that onto a slightly more secure to start with, and then eventually a permanent academic careers, that range or that filter gets even tighter. So just don't think, okay, well, if I do a really great PhD or DPhil and I do a really great postdoc, I will absolutely be able to make it into academia. The numbers just work against you. We have some amazing graduates from the Oxford DPhil programs who can't get into postdoc roles. We have some amazing postdocs who then cannot find a permanent academic career. By all means, go out for it. Try your best, but just be aware there is no guarantee in an academic career. Moreover, there are different pathways that people take. Some people will go through all of these stages that you see on the slides there. Others may not, as I've already said. For social scientists and humanities researchers, quite often there isn't a postdoc stage. That doesn't really exist as much as a feature in those areas. So they may catapult straight onto a junior lectureship, or they may take a teaching fellowship or an early career fellowship. But that's one typical pattern. Again, it's only typical and it's only a pattern. There are other ways in which people will end up moving from the DPhil or PhD stage onto the later positions, reader or professor, which are typically permanent positions. And we've got a nice, yes, just note that this is discipline specific. There's a nice demonstration here which came from a brief piece of work done on the way that academics within the Radcliffe Department of Medicine here at the University of Oxford had progressed from PhD. So they asked 6 or 7 staff, or what were your steps that you took? And as you can see from that diagram, people do things in different ways. Sometimes they go to postdocs, sometimes they go to teaching fellowships, career development fellowships. It really depends. There is no single path within academia. It's always going to depend on what the circumstances are. And whilst that example comes from medical sciences, the range of different possible trajectories is common across academia. There isn't just one pathway. So quick overview from what we know. The figures are not particularly exact, and I'm afraid this comes from some slightly out of date statistics, which were the Destination of Leavers from Higher Education survey, which no longer exists, but we don't quite have the full data from the more recent Graduate Outcomes Survey. So this is what we've got, and we can see there that, yes, a number of people from each discipline area do enter academia or higher education, and academia being there pretty much an academic research career or a lectureship career rather than just one of the other roles within higher education. But not all of those people will go on to researcher roles. So we can see there that whilst out of the medical sciences division and MPLS, those people who go into academia, most of those will actually go in research positions. In the social sciences and humanities, that's a different picture. A lot go in, but a lot of those people will be doing professional roles or perhaps pure teaching roles rather than going in to research roles. So bear that in mind. A career within academia is possible, but it's not necessarily going to be academic research that you go into. This diagram is taken from a publication which is slightly outdated, but I think the message that it conveys is still fairly accurate. This was looking particularly at science careers done by the Royal Society. And as you can see there, if we start at the left-hand side, the number of people coming out of PhDs who then managed to go on to sustain an early career research post, typically a postdoc or similar role. Some do go on, although some go out straight from their PhD into science industry roles. The number who get through to a permanent role is even less, with others again leaving at that stage or going to research in industry, etc. Those making it through to professor, a tiny less than 1%. So this is a bit of a scare diagram, perhaps, but I think the sentiment that actually along an academic career, many people, many great people will, for one reason or another, decide to leave. So again, it's the thing that we're saying here is, yes, a postdoc can be a great opportunity if it comes up, but again, don't assume that because you've done a postdoc, that's it, you've got it made, you will get through to a permanent academic career. So again, I'm going to ask you to just have a little think. We've seen that jobs are quite precarious and a postdoc isn't a guarantee that you'll get through to an academic job. That's one thing that you need to take into account when you're considering a postdoc. What are the other things that might worry you a little bit? Again, I'm going to give you a minute here just to make a note about any of your concerns, and then we'll hopefully address them in the coming slides, but also we can talk about them in the Q&A session at the end. So there is a financial angle to doing a postdoc. This research is not necessarily representative of everybody, but it's a good indication. So the graph that you can see on this slide comes from a paper looking at postdoctoral careers in biomedicine. It's from a Nature Biology publication from 2017. And that shows, if you look in close at those graphs, hopefully on your screens you're able to look into the detail, that in many sectors, in fact in each sector, the grey line, which represents postdoctoral earnings, is less, in some cases significantly so, than the red line, which demonstrates the earnings of those people who didn't do postdoc. So this is people who went out from the same degree course flow with a biomedicine PhD and then went out into either into different sectors or stayed in academia and did some postdoc work before progressing. So as you can see, the gap between those two lines, the grey line is those people with postdoc experience, the red line those without, is the lost earnings. So if money is an important aspect for you about planning your career, and it's absolutely fine to think that you want to be able to pay bills and perhaps have a holiday now and then, doing a postdoc is probably going to be less helpful to you than not doing a postdoc. Doesn't mean you shouldn't do one, but just take that into consideration, that there is a loss of earnings over your career from staying in postdoc, which is postdoc posts are generally not paid as well as industry posts. That doesn't mean you shouldn't consider them. There's an organisation called the Cheeky Scientists, which is designed to help people who have PhD training and or postdocs to help them move on into other sectors of the economy. And they have a post there. You can see the link and you'll get that. You can download these slides from Career Connect, where you booked this session, and follow that link. There's a lot of information there. Be critical in your reading. They have a particular angle that they're trying to sell to persuade you to leave academia. Nonetheless, they deal with some good hard truths about the way in which a postdoc can, for some people, bring you less progress than you might get if you went straight out into industry. It's a perspective. Other things to consider, and that top one there, the insecurity of short-term contracts, is probably the thing which most postdocs who come to see me for careers advice are concerned about. If you do stay in that world of postdocing and you're going from short-term contract to short-term contract, it is quite difficult to move on in your life. And as you get older and further out of your PhD, you may want to start a family, you may want to buy a house, you may want to just put down roots somewhere. That can be quite difficult, especially because the next point, possible need to relocate globally, comes into play. Many postdocs expect to have to move around the world. Academia is a global job market, and that's a fantastic thing in many respects. But it's not quite so fantastic if you want to actually settle down somewhere, build roots, and the only job coming up for you next is on the other side of the world. So it is a factor to take into consideration. It doesn't mean you shouldn't do a postdoc or even two postdocs, but it's a longer term consideration. And likewise, that already mentioned, starting a family. Postdocs work hard. Many work long hours. Particularly if you're in the sciences and you're lab based, you may find that you're rarely getting home before 7 or 8 in the evening. You may even work at weekends in order to keep up with things. That's not great if you want work-life balance. Not every postdoc will experience that, but many do. So worth thinking about those things. As I say, it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it on a short-term basis, but just be aware that this is the reality of doing postdoc work, not just in the UK, but around the world. If any of these are your reasons for doing a postdoc, then please think again. Just because your DPhil supervisor thinks that you'd be great, particularly if they think you'd be great in their team, that's really lovely. It's really flattering. It's not a reason for you to do that. You should only be thinking about doing a postdoc if you can really make that justification that this is a necessary and a productive step for your career, not what might be convenient for somebody who'd love to have you on their team because they know you and they know that you're great. We've looked at the financial side of things. You can also think about the value added side of having done a postdoc. in some industry sectors, so going into industry R&D, as we've said earlier, you may get some added value from being able to say, well, look, I've really deepened my research expertise through a postdoc, but that's a fairly limited part of the economy which actually requires that. If the only reason you're thinking about doing a postdoc is because it's easy, you're comfortable here, you know somebody who could, you know, it might be that your PI or your supervisor is offering something in front of you, that often happens, that a supervisor will say, yeah, actually, I could just do with somebody for 6 months, you'd be perfect. It's not really a great reason to make any kind of career decision, although you're absolutely free to take a job because it's easy, but think about this in the longer term. Think about those longer term outcomes, and if that is your motivation, please come and speak to a careers advisor and just check that whether you can actually get something more out of it than just that. We've already talked about the importance of, you know, planning, and if you come into a postdoc, you need to be able to have an exit strategy from the beginning. Postdoc drift is what happens when you go from one postdoc to another, or a short extension, and then maybe another extension of your contract. In order to avoid that, part of your exit strategy planning needs to be thinking about publications, which are still a major indicator of success in academia, although moves are being made to perhaps slightly reduce the significance of having publications in order to be able to move on in academia. Still, it's a really important factor. Knowing what your plan is, so knowing what the project plan is that you'll be working on, but also being able to carve out a little bit of time for yourself in order to think about, well, what do I want for my career and how am I going to take that forward? If I'm going to be applying for my own funding for my own project, how can I build that in, or how can I build the skills and expertise within this current postdoc to set me up for the next move? So really being clear about what your role would be and what you can do in terms of making space for your own career development. Absolutely essential. That's not something you can leave until you're about to finish your postdoc. That needs to be built in with thoughtfulness at the very beginning. Okay, this book I've already mentioned, please read it. If you're thinking about this, get hold of a second-hand copy from somewhere or get your college library to order a copy. It's a really, really essential book if you're considering postdocing. Okay, so if all of this hasn't put you off and you still think, yep, a postdoc would be a fantastic opportunity for me, some things you need to be doing right now are already building some networks. Try to gain expertise and insights from people who are already in your department or from people who are running projects. So from those principal investigators or senior academics who have project teams of their own. Understand how they recruit, what they look for, what kind of particular skills beyond what you're currently developing in your studies would be useful, so that you can start to work on those before you come to the point of applying. But also do some comparison. If you don't do a postdoc, if you're thinking, well, postdoc's just going to be a stepping stone to some career in another sector, just check your assumptions. Is this going to be useful? Talk to those people who've made similar transitions and understand what value doing a postdoc would bring, if any, in moving into those sectors, or are you actually better off just making that step immediately? And then understand, again, for the academic perspective, well, okay, if I were to get that postdoc, what would be a possible route out of that? How might people in my particular department or my area of specialism typically move on? What do I need to already be thinking about in order to make sure I don't get stuck in that postdoc drift and just go from one to another? And thinking about job descriptions, again, for both directions, whether academia or another sector, really being clear about what you're developing already in your studies, where you've already got the skills, and what are the things that you don't have which might be in demand in both worlds. Finally, if this talk has made you think, okay, well, perhaps that's not for me, it's never too early to start exploring alternatives. And there's a really lovely careers website, and I've just realized that that link is actually wrong. It should be http://research-careers.org, not www. But that's a really lovely collection. We've got about 110 profiles on there at the moment of people who've done a PhD and or a postdoc and then gone into different sectors of industry, and they talk about their experience of doing that transition. So if you're curious to know what else you could do coming out of a PhD other than a postdoc, that's a really great starting point. We've just had careers fairs. They've all finished for this term, but you can still have a look at the booklets from the careers fairs on the Careers Service website. You can see which employers came to the careers fairs, and if there are any there who are interesting to you, you can reach out to them and say, oh, sorry, didn't see you at the fair, but really interested to know how you might employ people with a PhD or other research training to go into your sector. We'll be running our careers conference for researchers next March. This is for all DPhil students and research staff, and it's focused exclusively on careers outside academia. So it's a great opportunity to, again, hear from people who've made transitions, think about the skills and how to present them to non-academic employers, and attend some workshops, maybe speak to some employers who are interested in recruiting researchers. Then there are also opportunities for you to just try a few things out. So you can join the Oxford Strategy Challenge, or you could consider doing an internship. Internships, both the summer programme and the micro internships programme, are open to all students at the university. Those are great ways to just start testing different career routes. More information here. I'm not going to talk through all of this. You can download the slides and find the full information on what our resources are on the Careers Service website, and how to book an appointment with a careers advisor from downloading those slides from Career Connect, from the place where you booked your attendance today.